Michael Collins slipped behind the lunar horizon, plunging into a chilling, absolute silence. Earth vanished. Radio contact died. For 48 minutes, he drifted through the deepest void known to man, severed from every living soul. NASA called it orbital mechanics, but Collins felt a primitive, crushing isolation that the history books sanitized for decades. He finally confessed the exact words of his secret terror. What was it he had to say, and why did it take so long? Collins' forgotten orbit role. While Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were busy making history on the lunar surface, Michael Collins stayed behind in the Columbia Command Module. He wasn't just waiting around for them. According to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, Collins was tasked with a role that demanded nerves of steel, orbiting the moon alone for 28 hours. Most people forget he circled that rock 14 times, and every single orbit brought him to the far side of the moon. This is the place people call the dark side, though it's actually bathed in sunlight. The real darkness wasn't about the lack of light. It was the total, suffocating loss of communication. You have to realize how fast the world disappeared for him. NASA records show that as he slipped behind the horizon, the radio signal didn't just fade, it snapped. 1 second, he had Houston in his ear, and the next, he was more isolated than any human being had ever been in the history of our species. He spent 47 minutes of every 2-hour orbit in that absolute silence. While the rest of the world watched the grainy footage of the Eagle landing, Collins was drifting over a cratered wasteland that no eyes had ever seen from that altitude without a partner. It's wild to think that if anything went wrong during those minutes, nobody would have known until he failed to emerge on the other side. The NASA flight transcripts from Apollo 11 actually capture the eerie transition into that void. They show the moments leading up to the loss of signal, where the chatter stops and the reality of the mission hits home. According to his own accounts in his memoir, he felt a strange sense of awareness that was almost physical. He knew that on the other side of that massive ball of rock, 3 billion people were living their lives, yet he was the only one who couldn't hear them. It wasn't just a technical gap, it was a complete severance from the human experience. What's truly fascinating is how the mission planners viewed this. Wikipedia notes that the command module pilot was essentially the lifeline for the entire mission. If the lunar module crashed or failed to launch, Collins would have had to live with the knowledge of his crewmate's fate while piloting the ship back to Earth alone. He wasn't just a taxi driver, he was the guardian of the only way home. And every time he crossed into that radio shadow, he was reminded that he was the most solitary man in existence. And that's the part that gets strange. You'd expect a pilot to be terrified of that kind of silence, especially when you're traveling at thousands of miles per hour through a vacuum. Instead, Collins described a feeling that wasn't exactly fear, but it wasn't comfort either. He looked down at the rugged, alien terrain of the far side and realized he was seeing things that were meant to stay hidden. He was a witness to a side of the moon that had been a mystery for eons. It's enough to make you wonder what actually ran through his mind in that total isolation. Radio blackout terror hits. Imagine sitting in a tin can, moving at thousands of miles per hour, while the entire universe slowly goes quiet. That was Michael Collins' reality every time he crossed into the radio shadow of the moon. It wasn't just a quiet room or a long walk in the woods. According to his famous accounts in his autobiography, Carrying the Fire, the silence was absolute and physical. It hit him the moment the signal from Houston died. He described a feeling that most of us can't even process, where he wasn't just lonely, but entirely removed from the human map. He sat there in the dim light of the cabin, listening to the hum of the machines, knowing that for nearly an hour he didn't exist to anyone else. It's actually haunting when you look at the specific way he recorded his thoughts during those moments. He wrote that he felt the isolation deeply, noting that he was now truly alone, absolutely alone, and separated from any known life. This wasn't some poetic exaggeration for a book deal later on. He was actually tracking the math of his own solitude. According to an ABC News retrospective on his secret mission tensions, Collins did a mental head count that would give anyone chills. He realized that on the other side of that massive lunar wall, there were 3 billion people, plus his 2 crewmates, down on the surface. That meant everyone who had ever lived, loved, or spoken was grouped in one direction, and he was the only soul on the other side of the curve. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum notes that while people call him the loneliest man in history, Collins actually claimed he felt a certain peace. But you have to wonder if that's just the talk of a professional pilot who wasn't allowed to crack under pressure. When you read between the lines of his transcripts, you see a man who was acutely aware that he was one mechanical failure away from being a permanent ghost in orbit. He didn't have a backup. He didn't have a voice in his ear telling him he was doing a good job. He just had the ticking of the clock and the cold light of the stars. And that's the part that gets strange, because he seemed to lean into that darkness rather than pull away from it. Most people would have been clawing at the walls, waiting for that radio to hiss back to life. Instead, Collins spent his time looking at the far side of the moon, a place that looked like a battered battlefield of craters and dust. He knew that if Neil and Buzz didn't make it back up, he'd be the only person left to tell the story, or worse, the only person left to carry the guilt of leaving them behind. He carried a secret list of things that could go wrong, and many of them involved him having to burn the engine and head home by himself. It's a level of psychological weight that would break a normal person. Here's the real kicker though. Even though he was the loneliest man in the solar system, he felt a strange connection to the void. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a sentinel. He was watching the back door of the moon, while the rest of humanity was focused on the front porch. He was the only person who knew what it felt like to be completely forgotten by the species, even if only for 47 minutes at a time. It makes you realize that his solitude wasn't just a technical necessity of the mission. It was a profound shift in how he saw his place in the universe. Did this spark fear of crew loss? Secret fear of solo return? It is one thing to be lonely, but it's a completely different brand of nightmare to realize you might be the only person coming home from the greatest heist in history. While Michael Collins was drifting through that silent void on the far side of the moon, he wasn't just thinking about the stars or his math. He was obsessing over a scenario that NASA didn't like to talk about. According to an interview he did with ABC News, Collins lived with a secret terror that had nothing to do with his own life ending. He was terrified that the Eagle's engine would fail to ignite or that it would crash during the ascent, leaving Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stranded on the lunar surface forever. People always talk about the bravery of the guys on the ground, but they forget the psychological trap Collins was sitting in. If things went south, he had very specific, very cold orders. According to a feature in the Vintage News, he'd have to fire his own engines and leave them behind. He knew that he wouldn't just be a survivor, he'd be the guy who had to face the world as the lone man who returned while his friends were left to suffocate in the lunar dust. He actually wrote about this in his memoirs, admitting that he'd be a marked man for the rest of his life if that happened. He said he would have been that guy who left them up there to die. And that's the part that gets strange. He wasn't just worried about his reputation or the tragedy of it all, he was worried about the literal weight of that solitude. As he told Space.com years later, the idea of being the sole survivor was a ghost that followed him through every single one of those 14 orbits. He sat in that cockpit, looking at the empty seat next to him, realizing that it might stay empty for the entire journey back to Earth. You can imagine him checking and rechecking the docking systems, not just because he was a pro, but because the alternative was a psychological hell no human had ever navigated. Most of us would have been a nervous wreck, but Collins had to keep his hands steady. He knew there were over a dozen different ways the rendezvous could fail, and in every single one of those math problems, he ended up alone in a capsule for 3 days of radio silence and public mourning. It's wild to think about, because we always view Apollo 11 as this perfect, heroic triumph. In reality, for the guy in the command module, it was a terrifying gamble where the stakes were his own soul. He didn't want to be the hero. He just didn't want to be the survivor who had to explain why he was alive, and they weren't. Looking back at his calm demeanor in the official NASA photos, you'd never guess he was carrying that kind of baggage. He played the part of the cool, detached astronaut perfectly, but the research shows he was sweating every second of that orbit. He was trapped in a high-speed metal box with nothing but his own dark thoughts and the cratered, gray landscape below him. By the time the Eagle finally cleared the surface and headed his way, he wasn't just happy to see his friends. He was relieved not to be a ghost. How did solitude shift his worldview? Far Side's rugged mystery. When Michael Collins looked out the window of the Columbia while drifting over the far side, he didn't see the familiar man in the moon we all grew up with. He saw something much more chaotic and, frankly, a bit unsettling. Most of us think the moon looks the same all the way around, but it actually has two completely different faces. According to the detailed breakdown on Wikipedia, the near side is covered in these smooth, dark patches called Maria, which were formed by ancient volcanic activity. But once Collins crossed that threshold into the hidden half, those smooth plains completely vanished. He was staring at a rugged, battered wasteland that looked like it had been used for target practice since the dawn of time. It is wild to think about how different the scenery was for him during those 47 minutes of radio silence. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum notes that the far side is almost entirely composed of high, jagged mountains and endless, overlapping craters. There are no vast seas of basalt to break up the monotony. For Collins, this wasn't just a change in geology, it was a visual reminder that he was truly in the wild, looking at a part of our solar system that had been shielded from human eyes for billions of years. He described it as a rough, forbidding place that didn't look anything like the gentle silver orb we see from a backyard in Ohio. And that's the part that gets strange. Because the crust on the far side is much thicker than the side facing Earth, the lava never broke through to create those smooth landing spots. Collins was flying over a terrain that was pure, unadulterated chaos. A NASA Goddard video visualization shows just how dense those impact sites are, and seeing it from only 60 miles up must have been dizzying. He was essentially looking at the moon's shield, the side that takes all the hits from space debris, so Earth doesn't have to. He was the first person to truly sit with that view in total solitude, watching a billion years of history scroll by underneath his boots. You'd think after 14 orbits he'd get used to it, but he couldn't stop looking. He was fascinated by the sheer violence of the landscape. Every crater represented a massive explosion, and there were so many of them that they started to lose their individual shapes. It was just a textured, gray infinity. He noted that the lack of color and the harshness of the shadows made the whole place feel ancient in a way that made human life seem like a tiny, insignificant blip. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a witness to the raw power of the universe. The contrast between that battered gray rock and the life he left behind started to mess with his head a bit. He knew that just around the corner of that horizon, the world was waiting. But in the moment, it felt like the far side was the only reality that mattered. He was floating in a void, looking at a shield, waiting for a signal that would prove he wasn't the last man alive. It makes you realize that his perspective was being permanently altered by the sheer strangeness of the view. What overview effect hit him when viewing Earth? Overview effect awakens. Everything changed the moment Michael Collins emerged from that 47-minute blackout and saw the Earth rising over the lunar horizon. After spending nearly an hour staring at the battered, lifeless gray of the far side, that tiny blue marble didn't just look like a planet, it looked like a miracle. According to his deep reflections in his book, Carrying the Fire, he realized right then that the Earth wasn't this massive, indestructible thing we think it is while we're standing on it. From 60 miles above the moon, it looked fragile, lonely, and incredibly small against the pitch-black curtain of space. He didn't just see a map, he saw every person he ever loved and every conflict humanity ever had contained within a single, shimmering dot that could be blotted out by his thumb. It is wild to think about how that isolation actually fixed his perspective rather than breaking it. Most people would come back from the moon talking about the glory or the technology, but Collins came back obsessed with the planet he'd almost been forced to return to alone. Space.com notes that he spent much of his later life advocating for the protection of our environment because he'd seen the alternative. He'd spent hours looking at a world that was dead and scarred, and it made him realize that we're all passengers on a very small, very vulnerable ship. He became one of the most vocal supporters for conservation because he knew exactly what it felt like to be separated from the only life support system we have. And that's the part that gets strange. You'd think the loneliest man would be bitter or disconnected when he got back to Houston. Instead, he seemed more connected to the human race than ever before. He often spoke about how he wished political leaders could sit in that command module for just one orbit. He felt that if they could see the Earth without borders, without visible religions or politics, just a bright blue jewel in a cold vacuum, they'd stop fighting over the dust. In a NASA interview featured on their YouTube channel, he emphasized that the view from the far side made all our earthly problems seem ridiculously insignificant. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He had become a globalist in the most literal sense of the word. There's a specific kind of hope in that realization. Collins found a way to take the most terrifying solitude imaginable and turn it into a reason to care about the people he left behind. He realized that we're all 3 billion plus 2 in a way. We're all drifting through a silent universe together, and the only thing that keeps the darkness at bay is the fact that we have each other. He didn't come back with ghost stories or conspiracy theories. He came back with a warning and a plea for us to start acting like the crew of one single tiny vessel. The transition from the rugged mystery of the far side back to the vibrant colors of home was the ultimate wake-up call for him. It's a perspective we desperately need right now as we look toward going back to the moon and eventually Mars. We're starting to realize that the further we go into the dark, the more we value the light we carry with us. It makes you wonder how these lessons from the 60s link to today's far-side probes. Michael Collins faced the ultimate void, realizing he was one plus God knows what, while everyone else shared the Earth. He survived the far side's silence, but that secret isolation changed humanity's story forever. If you were alone back there, what would you think?